We have Joseph, pronouns he, him, from Maryland. And Joseph wants to argue that atheists don't have a good way of getting any moral system. Hello, Joseph. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. I like your show. I like the way you refine Christianity by tearing down like the worst viewpoints in it. So I really like all that. So good show. Having said that, I don't see a convincing means by which atheists can come up with a moral like framework, right? So Harris came up with a whole system of like why morality could be real and why we could have a moral system, but he didn't really come up with a means of actually like compelling people to do good. So how do you propose to compel people under atheism to behave in a moral way?
How do you propose to get them to behave in a moral way without atheism?
Yeah, like how without using like a God who's the ground of morality.
No, Joseph,
tell people to act a specific way.
Joseph, you didn't hear my question correctly. I replied by saying, how do you get people to behave morally by using a God?
Oh, okay. You just have to come up with a system of oughts, and I think the best way to come up with a system of oughts is you're created for a purpose, and your purpose is what you ought to do. And if you rebel against that, there's an obvious consequence, which is when you rebel against that, you self-inflict hell. And if you die in that state, then you're forever in the state of self-inflicted misery by doing immoral work. So that's how Christians can come up with the idea of morality.
So Joseph, my point here is that your objection to secular moral systems, which there are many of, and none of them were invented by Sam Harris. Sam Harris is describing a moral system that I had spoken about before. If you go look up my superiority of secular morality, my point is that there's no objection that someone can launch with respect to secular moral systems that is in any way solved by appealing to a God. And when I asked you how you could convince people to be moral by appealing to a God, you said that, well, you think the first thing you should do is come up with some oughts. Well, you don't just get to come up with oughts, because if you come up with oughts, how is that different from me coming up with oughts? And if I reject your oughts and your God, what do you do then?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. That's why you have to.
That's why I asked.
Whole discussion here. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I didn't do a very good job of answering that. Sorry about that. You're right. Better means to say is you have to demonstrate, I guess, which God is real. Then you have to demonstrate the whole grounding of moral systems. And I mean, I think that's a complicated question. I don't know that we have the time to get into all that. Especially
hang on.
Morality.
So Joseph, you said you have to start by demonstrating which God is real. But if we're talking about morality, shouldn't you have to first demonstrate that a God is in any way relevant to morality, right?
Well, yeah. So if you can't have a decent morality under atheism,
I think you can. I think you absolutely can. I'm pointing out that the objection isn't solved by appealing to a God. And when you say the first thing you have to do is demonstrate which God is real, well, what if you demonstrated that a God is real? How do you know that that God is in any way relevant to the foundation of a moral system?
I mean, I agree it's a complex thing. I don't know that I have the time to get into all that. So I would, I'd rather hear what is your basis for an atheist moral system, I guess is what I'm more interested in this call. And the other question is, it's a very long topic.
Yes, it is a very long topic. It's a topic that I've lectured on many times. I've talked about it on this show over and over and over again. You could Google my talk on the superiority of secular morality, but here's the nutshell. For me, I adopt a position that well-being is the thing that we're really talking about when we talk about morality. And beginning with a few simple precepts, like life is generally preferable to death, health is generally preferable to sickness, you can set up a foundation. And then what you begin to build off of that is, do the consequences of my actions, how do those compare to the goal of well-being? There's not always going to be an easy answer, but I can't think of a better foundation or a better system, because one of the differences between secular moral systems like what I advocate and religious moral systems like you're advocating is that secular moral systems have as a defined goal the the goal to become better at both understanding and reaching the conclusions that are better for the participants in that moral system. And the way that those things change is through evaluation of data and debate and discussion. On the contrary, religious systems, there's no guarantee that any religious system has our best interests at mind at all. There's no guarantee that the foundation of any religious system is actually real. There's no demonstration that it's actually good. When a particular God says, you know, go forth and kill all of these other people because I say so, okay. Or if a God says it's sinful for a man to lie with a man, okay. Well, I don't care what that God thinks, and there's no demonstration and no showing at all that this is in our best interest. And so every objection that people launch at secular moral systems can never be solved by a God, because if the most you can do is say, well, Matt, your moral system is just your opinion. And my response is, so is yours. And you can point to a God, and claim that it's God's opinion, but it's just another opinion. And I don't believe that God exists, nor do I give a fuck about what his opinion is. And if it's correct, if it was morally good, if anything that religions were advocating were truly morally good, they would be able to demonstrate that they're truly morally good. And we would not be having discussions that are too lengthy for us to go into on whether or not secular ethics are decent, because they are.
Okay, so I guess my main critique of that would be, how do you translate "you ought to pursue well-being" into
I didn't.
actual
I didn't.
bullshit?
I didn't.
He did not.
Okay, so then how do you tell someone to pursue, like, I guess one thing is like,
Joseph, can I ask you a very quick question with a very quick answer, if possible? I would like to ask you a very, very quick question. So you are telling us that it is not possible, or it's hard without God to establish a good moral system. If you can reply to this very briefly, is that a problem, and why?
So, what's I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I don't know exactly what you meant by that. I'm sorry.
Is it a problem that without God, so in an atheistic worldview, we cannot establish a good moral system? Is that a problem, and why?
Well, I think that is a problem, because if you have a world where people really like just do things on a whim without any sort of like convictions or anything, well, I mean, it collapses very quickly. Like, you can have a structured society, but everyone's just looking out for their own self-interest, and it very easily seems to degrade into selfishness. And and it seems like a God prevents that, not because his opinion, but because the idea is that when you do something wrong, you're actually hurting yourself, and you're putting yourself in misery when you do less good for others. So that's the idea behind the Christian moral system.
First of all, I was a Christian for 20 some odd years. I don't need, I'm familiar with what different Christians think, but I don't think that answered the question. So here's the thing. You had asked me a question of how do you convince people about this foundation of well-being, correct?
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
Do you care about Joseph, do you care about your well-being?
Sorry. I would say I do.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you know anybody who really doesn't care about their well-being?
No. But
then your question is absolutely moot and irrelevant, because I don't have to spend any time convincing people to care about their well-being. Meanwhile, you want to disparage selfishness. What's wrong with selfishness? Did you realize that you can get to altruism from selfishness? Well, I think we're having an audio issue that we're going to get back here in a second. But the reason I asked that question, this is what I mean when there's no problem people raise with secular moral systems that is solved by appealing to a God. And their concern is like, how do you convince people they should care about their well-being? They already do. And anybody who doesn't, you can have the conversation to talk about why they should be interested in their well-being. And what that means, that it's not mere selfishness. It's not like, hey, let me put all of my own interests first. So let me just take something irrespective of the consequences. It is about recognizing that you live and have to share space with other people. And so their well-being impacts yours.
I mean, I have a very simple approach to this, Matt. Tell me if you think I'm
Sure.
completely wrong about this. But I like to see it this way, that in a hypothetical state where I simply pop into existence out of nothing,
Mhm.
and I find myself in a world, I'm surrounded by plants and goods and all that. I feel hunger. I go around and eat things and try to survive, make myself a safe place where I feel warm and sleep and all that. Everything seems good, but after a while, I realize that there are other people around me, and I cannot do everything that I want. I cannot take their things because they are also looking out for their own safety and for stilling their own hunger. I cannot attack them. Somehow we have to coexist in this environment where they also popped into existence in
Right.
order not to steal from each other and kill each other, because killing each other would that guy killing me would put my whole well-being obviously in danger, would annul it. In order to solve that problem and live together, we necessarily establish several rules, like, hey, you know what, I will not take your stuff forcibly, you will not take my stuff forcibly.
Yep.
And that is how we slowly establish morals. Now, if you don't like those morals, if you say we can never establish a perfect moral system, well, so what? We are trying to do the best, which is in our own interest, for our well-being. If you go to religion in order to establish a strict, unchangeable moral system, you will have a problem, because you will be stuck with certain rules that are over time maybe not in your best interest, not in the best interest of everybody. So there is no real problem.
I don't know how rigid the Christian moral system is. I mean, the goal, like, it seems like there's quite a bit of variance and quite a bit of things do for the well-being of mankind. So it's not exactly clear to me that the Christian moral system is actually rigid in the purest understanding of Christianity. Now, some forms of Christianity obviously go into rigid systems, but I don't think that the actual Christian moral system as it originally is actually a very rigid, constraining thing that can
I'm
never...
sorry, did either of us say that it was rigid or that rigidity was a problem? I mean, I think rigidity is a problem, but I don't recall us mentioning that.
I thought you just said that the Christian moral system was rigid and unchanging, and that was a problem because it couldn't update.
Yeah, I think to be fair, he's referring to the idea that I said, that if you go with a certain established religious system, then you are stuck with a sense of morality that
Okay,
cannot change
okay.
over time.
Yeah, but one of your objections, Joseph, was this thing of selfishness. What is your motivation for being a Christian?
To go against that would go against my very human nature. And
No, Joseph, that's wrong. That is, so I may put my Christian hat on. Isn't the human nature a sinful nature? Isn't it a fallen nature?
I mean, not with the resurrection, not after Christ saved us and made us a redeemed nature.
No, you're not automatically redeemed. You have a sinful nature. The fact that you are forgiven doesn't mean that you are without sin and that you don't have a sinful fallen nature. It's not, human beings cannot comprehend.
That's why Christ is the new Adam. That's why Christ. So because now our Father is no longer like a sinful, right? Now we're descended from someone who is perfect. So now I'm no longer a sinful.
You're not descended from anybody who's perfect.
That's what the belief is with Jesus. And
you're not descended from Jesus, and Jesus wasn't perfect. But so if you're talking about, moral systems, are you trying to avoid hell or get to heaven? Are you trying to make God favor you?
Well, hell is the state where you exclude yourself from everyone else. So essentially, when you hate everyone.
No. I know it's not the state where you exclude yourself. I didn't decide to exclude myself. Let's not play that. I asked a question about your motivation for morality. Is it to avoid hell and to gain heaven?
Well, if hell is the state of exclusion, everybody else, then yes, your goal is to avoid hell.
Is that not selfish of you? Is that not selfish of you to avoid hell? Want to avoid hell?
To wish the good of every single other person as well as your own? That's what heaven and hell...
No.
You didn't answer
You're
the
not
question.
listening, Joseph. You're not paying any attention to what I'm actually saying. If your motivation, if your personal motivation is for you to avoid hell, how is that not selfish?
Because hell is hating others. So my personal motivation is to avoid hating
Wow.
others.
I'm sorry, but at this point, you're no longer being honest in conversation. For you personally to want to avoid hell, my question is, how is that not selfish?
Well, I mean, does that really matter if you're seeking your own good, if it means
It
entailing?
matters if one of your objections to a secular moral system is that it's selfish. That's the point that I'm making, that your motivation is no less selfish.
I don't think that's exactly the same thing, right? So,
Well, it is.
I think it very much is.
You can seek heaven for your own, because then you're also seeking the good of others, which is what heaven is.
No. Hey, look, because I could say the same thing about my secular moral system, that because I recognize I share space with other people, even from a point of pure selfishness, I can get to altruism, because engaging in altruistic acts benefits the society, which benefits me. And so I could say, I'm not being selfish. I'm actually being altruistic. And the truth is, to some extent, I'm being both. But my point was that you made an objection against secular moral systems because they're selfish, when in truth, your view is selfish as well.
I have a whole problem with the entire approach here, and with the entire idea of why we are establishing a moral system. I mean, we are not really putting the sequences of the causes and effects in the correct way. Joseph, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's true that you independently arrive at the conclusion that humans are sinful and selfish, and that if they don't do anything about this, they will go to hell. You don't arrive at that conclusion and therefore rationally conclude that we should follow a certain moral system because any other moral system will not solve that problem. No, you simply come up with this response or with this solution to a problem because you believe that God exists, that heaven and hell are real. You believe that humans are sinful. You don't actually have any proof for that. You don't arrive rationally at that conclusion. And based on all those presuppositions that you have, you then say, okay, therefore, no moral system in this world is actually good, because none of those solves the problem of our sinful nature. None of those helps us avoid hell and whatever it is. So I think the entire approach here is false, and we can do nothing to convince you unless you agree that your beliefs are actually false.
So your criticism of me is that I have not yet built up the entire foundation of Christianity by which to then claim a moral system, and I've started with assuming the base of Christianity as a moral system in the interest of, time saving.
Why I'm telling you that you believe Christianity to be true theologically to begin with, which is why you then, based on that, judge worldly moral systems or atheistic moral systems as insufficient or not good enough. But that's simply your interpretation of things based on your presupposition that your Christian beliefs are true.
So while it was too big, hang on. While it was too big of a topic and too long of a topic for you to actually answer questions about how and why you feel that your moral system is superior, I did exactly that. I outlined the foundations and the structure behind a moral system in a nutshell, pointed you to a lecture that does even more than that, and asked questions about, if you're going to object on the grounds that it's selfish, how is your position any less selfish? And I stayed away from the questions of, is your moral system true? How could you demonstrate it? Is it actually in our best interest? Because you weren't ready to address those questions. You weren't ready to address those questions at all. It's like you haven't even considered the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something moral because God says so, or does God say so because it's moral?
Well, that's a very easy thing. The moral system is a part of God's nature, and so
yeah, that's not an answer to the question.
Well, I was getting there. So
no, you weren't.
Says something is moral. I was going to be.
No, you weren't, Joseph. I'm an expert at this. I've been doing it for more than 17 years. And when I present the Euthyphro dilemma, and the question is two-pronged, does God say something is moral because it's already moral, or is something become moral because God says so? To say it's about God's nature is a way of avoiding the question. You have to pick one of those two prongs in order to answer the question. So don't tell me you were going to answer the question if you started off by avoiding it. I've done this for a long time. Okay. Is something moral in your view because God says so, Whether or not it's consistent with his nature is irrelevant. Or does something already moral?
All right, I'll cut straight to the end. Something is moral because God wills it. I guess I can't tell you why I reached that conclusion.
Yeah, you can't. There is no reason to reach that conclusion. You have no evidence that there is a God. You now have pawned off the entirety of your morality and everything that you would have to do to think about your morality to just say it's God's will. How do you or anyone else know what God's will is? And if we were able to know what God's will is, how would we determine that it is in fact a moral position?
So you're interested in the buildup now?
I'm asking you questions. Why are you being snarky instead of just
okay.
answering them?
Oh, I'm not. I was doing that buildup.
How do we know what God's will is? And then once we know what God's will is, how do we know that it is in fact moral?
I would say through analysis of, well, like, first of all, you figure out what God is. He's a spirit, what spirits get and things. And you start off by figuring out what God is. Then you figure out what human nature is. And I'm 18, right? I have not done enough to actually be able to give satisfactory answers to someone like you, much more experience on this at the time. But the way you go about that is figuring those questions out. Then through those questions, you can figure out a system of why exactly it is that God's nature reflects human nature. And so
Joseph?
why what he says is what he's doing.
If somebody came to you and told you that they believed something to be the case, and when you asked them the methodology, they were to say, well, first you have to figure out what God is, and God's a spirit. Then you have to figure out human nature. Would you point out that they're not answering the question and that in fact they do not have a sound, rational foundation for the belief they're espousing if they haven't actually done that work?
Well, given that I mean, it depends on who the person is. But
No, it doesn't. No, it fucking doesn't. It does not depend. Nothing any of us could ever say depends on who the person is. If nothing else gets through to you, it's about it. Pay attention to this. You are now floundering and engaging in fallacies, appeals to special pleading about the person. The question that I asked was, how can we, all of us, know what God's will is? And your answer is, I don't know, I'm only 18, but you first got to figure out what God is, and God's a spirit. That means that you cannot possibly have a rational position because you haven't done the work to establish it. You don't even know what work it would take.
I just laid out what work it would take.
Have you done that work? Have you showed what God is? Prove to me what God's will is.
God's will is the universe. God's will.
I didn't ask what God's will was. I said, prove to me that it's God's will.
All right. So the will of God, since God's an infinite being, that's where he wants. Seems like the will of God is.
I don't know how you know God's an infinite being, but how do you prove that something is the will of God?
Well, so we're saying, so if the idea of God that we're both using is an infinitely powerful being, then anything that happens must be his will, it would seem like, because everything it's happening. So clearly the infinitely powerful being is okay with it happening.
Okay, then clearly, according to your definition, the infinitely powerful being is fine with me exposing that you don't have a rational foundation for your beliefs and that you advocate a moral system that you can't back up, whereas I've advocated a moral system that is both reasonable and sorted. And also, when we hang up on you in a second, that's also God's will, correct?
I would, yeah. Because
cool.
Evil things.
And is it God's will? Is it God's will when children get raped? Is it God's will when children get cancer?
Yes. As hard as it may be, that.
And fuck your God and fuck you for making excuses for it. We're moving on.
Thank you, Joseph, for calling. I think we are done with this.